Gary Lineker says he helped draft the new social media guidelines for staff at the BBC and says they allow presenters much more freedom to express their views. Despite this, he claims he's never breached them and always tweets sensibly. Joining me to discuss this, former BBC executive Tim Luckhurst. Hello, Tim. Thanks for joining me. Do you agree? A, do you think he helped draft the new guidelines? And B, do you think he has always tweeted sensibly? It's caused an awful lot of ruckus if he has, hasn't he?
I think helps a major exaggeration, Vanessa. John Hardy, the former ITV executive who wrote the BBC's social media guidelines for non-news staff, spoke to more than 80 people at the BBC before he drafted his new set of rules for engagement on social media. I know that Gary Lineker was one of those 80 people, but I don't think the 79 plus others have claimed to have helped to write the rules. I think that they were interviewed by the person who actually wrote the rules. So Gary is exaggerating at the very least.
And how have the rules changed? Because obviously there is now more freedom for BBC faces, presenters, employees to say what they think politically and in all sorts of other ways.
Well, the guidelines, remember, relate to non-news staff. The rules governing BBC journalists and current affairs staff have always been extremely strict. These are rules which deal with high-profile people who work in non-news roles, like sports presenters like Gary Lineker. And they make it clear that whilst these people are entitled to have opinions, they're not allowed, whilst they still work for the BBC, to campaign on political issues. And I would suggest that Gary Lineker has come very close to, indeed, may well have been campaigning on political issues. He has, after all, been extremely critical of Conservative MPs. He has been particularly critical of Grant Shapps, a cabinet minister. He has been quite hostile to the government's plans to send illegal immigrants to Rwanda, which is a Conservative Party policy. I'm not aware that Gary Lineker has yet objected to any policy brought forward by the Labour Party. He seems to me to be someone who dislikes Conservative policy and is more likely to side with the Liberal left. Now, that's a perfectly respectable point of view, but if he's not supposed to campaign on political issues, I would suggest that Gary Lineker's social media presence implies that he is quite closely aligned with one side of the political divide. And I think that the BBC would be wise to tell him that that's not a good place to be.
But how can they tell him if he says he drafted the rules himself? How can they tell him?
Look, the BBC paid Gary Lineker about £1.35 million last year, and I take the view that any employer who is so generously funding a star presenter's life is entitled to say, look, this comes at a price. Yes, Gary Lineker is an extremely talented sports commentator and sports analyst. He was a brilliant footballer and he knows a great deal about football.
Tim, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me.